Con Thien was one of the bloodiest small unit battles of the Vietnam War. On the morning of July 2, 1967, it was already going catastrophically wrong. At 9:30, Bravo Company's lead platoon takes rifle fire from a hedgerow west of Route 561, 2,000 meters northeast of Con Thien. The Marines wheel to engage what they read as a squad in a trench, but the firing does not stop. Then fire opens from the trees in front of the column and from the paddy on its right. Alpha Company, moving up parallel to support them, has hit mines and cannot break through. Bravo is fixed on a 10-foot cart road with no way back. At the command post at Con Thien, the picture is fragmentary and getting worse. Lieutenant Colonel Sheening, the battalion commander, has 4 tanks he can send, but committing them north means stripping Con Thien's own perimeter, a perimeter that has already been overrun once. He must choose between reaching Bravo and holding the hill. Con Thien was a low hill 2 miles south of the DMZ, held by 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, fewer than 400 men across 4 rifle companies, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta. From its hillocks, the Marines could observe the principal NVA movement corridors into Quang Tri Province, which was exactly why the NVA needed to neutralize it. But holding the hill meant patrolling the ground around it. Route 561, the battalion's only ground supply route running south to Cam Lo, passed through a junction 2,000 meters northeast of Con Thien that the Marines called the Marketplace, open ground with no natural cover and no defensible position. The trace, 6 miles of bulldozed earth, connecting Con Thien to Gio Linh, was supposed to become a fortified barrier, but the engineers assigned to complete it had never installed the wire, mines, and sensors needed for the defense. The ground was cleared, but uncontrolled. Every time the Marines swept through the surrounding hedgerows and withdrew, the NVA moved back in behind them, along the same cart roads, through the same junctions, past the same marketplace. It was a pattern the NVA had been mapping for months. Intelligence through June indicated the NVA were preparing another offensive, but the sweep that Charlie and Delta companies ran through the marketplace area found nothing. No contact, no sign of recent occupation, no enemy. But that silence was not a relief. The veterans who knew the area said so directly. Not finding anything in the marketplace was a sure sign the NVA were up to something. They had cleared out ahead of the patrol, which was exactly what they did before they came back in force. Colonel Giroux, commanding the 9th Marines, was not prepared to wait. On July 1st, he launched Operation Buffalo, a push to drive the NVA Regiment from the approaches to Con Thien, sending Alpha and Bravo companies back into the marketplace area before the enemy could dig in and prepare. Alpha set in near the DMZ. Bravo crossed the trace and established itself along Route 561, 1,500 meters to Alpha's southeast. But Bravo was already below strength when it moved out. Roughly 150 men instead of 200, spread across 3 platoons of around 50 each. Junior leaders filling roles a rank above their experience, and replacements who had not yet seen a serious fight. That night, Bravo's ambush squads heard movement close to the road, Vietnamese voices. The NVA moved parallel to Route 561 in the dark, but did not step into the kill zones. By first light on July 2nd, the order to advance north was unchanged. At 0800 on the morning of July 2nd, 90 minutes before the ambush, Bravo Company formed up along Route 561 and moved north. The road was a 10-foot cart track between waist-high hedgerows and sun-dried paddy fields. 3rd Platoon on point led the column. Captain Coates and the command group followed. Then 2nd Platoon with the XO and the mortars, and at the back, 1st Platoon under Staff Sergeant Burns, with orders to secure a landing zone for resupply later in the day. 2 kilometers north of the trace, 2nd Platoon cleared a junction without contact, and the ground felt quiet. But to the west, Alpha had already hit booby traps, medevacs had been called, and the company was falling behind. At 0930, 3rd Platoon reached the marketplace and several shots cracked from a hedgerow to the west. 3rd Platoon wheeled and assaulted what they read as a small NVA position, but the position fired back with AK-47s and did not fall back. Before Coates could reassess, fire opened from the tree line in front of the column and from the paddy field on its right. He pushed 2nd Platoon right to flank it, but the eastern hedgerows were already firing. 2nd Platoon was driven back onto the road as mortars began falling along the column. Alpha still could not break through, and every direction that offered a way out was already closed by heavy NVA fire. Bravo Company, 150 Marines, was fixed on a 10-foot road, surrounded by 2 battalions of the 90th NVA Regiment. Then the artillery shells started landing. Coates tried one more move, a 2-squad assault into the tree line to the northwest, but the squads were pinned and most did not return. NVA infantry crossed the road between the platoons and the company was split. The command group was hit and Coates was killed. Captain Kennep, the forward air controller, was now in command. He sent one last message to the battalion's CP. "We are being overrun." Then the command group went silent. At the back of the column, Staff Sergeant Burns and 1st Platoon knew nothing of what had happened at the front except what they could hear. NVA infantry were pressing from the east, and he was calling napalm in at 20 yards while holding what was left of 1st Platoon together. He fought north, found the remnants of 2nd Platoon, and pulled them into a perimeter. Then he got on the radio. When the pilot asked who he was, Burns told him he was Bravo 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, every platoon. If help didn't arrive soon, this was going to be the lost command. Shortly after noon, Lieutenant Colonel Sheening dispatched 4 tanks and a platoon from Delta Company to find whatever was left of Bravo. Leading the column was Captain Radcliffe, the battalion's assistant operations officer, new to the job, but the senior man available. 1st Lieutenant Howell, the battalion intelligence officer, went alongside because he had led one of Bravo's platoons and knew the ground. The column moved east along the trace and turned north onto Route 561 without incident. But the moment it turned north, it came under fire. An NVA unit was already moving south to cut the road behind Bravo's survivors. The tanks drove through it, and Radcliffe ordered Delta's platoon to dismount at the trace junction and hold it. If that position fell, there was no way back. Half a mile up the road, Radcliffe found Burns and asked where the rest of Bravo Company was. Burns told him, "Sir, this is the company, or what's left of it." The situation was worse than anyone at the Con Thien CP had understood, but Radcliffe told Burns they were going back up the road and asked if he was coming. Burns joined him. Howell moved through the hedgerows and irrigation ditches alongside them, pulling wounded men out of the grass while fire was still coming in. One Marine they found had been tied to a tree, left there as bait for whoever came looking. Radcliffe and Burns pushed north toward the Marketplace Junction, the last known position of Bravo's command group, so every step forward was both a rescue and a potential ambush. Dead Marines lined both sides of Route 561 for the full length of Bravo's column. The tanks took on as many wounded as they could carry, but 34 dead had to be left where they had fallen. There was no way to bring them and the wounded out at the same time. With the wounded loaded, Radcliffe ordered the withdrawal south, but the NVA followed the column every meter back to the trace, snipers, mortars, and artillery tracking them all the way, and men who had survived the ambush were killed on the tanks before the column reached safety. Charlie Company arrived by helicopter to cover the extraction, but immediately walked into an NVA artillery barrage, leaving 11 wounded before the company could even form a line. When the survivors finally reached the trace at around 1600, those men were still on the road. Recovering them was going to take days and far more than one battalion. The 34 casualties left on Route 561 after the ambush could not stay there. 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, already operating in the sector under Operation Buffalo, had been holding north of the trace overnight. They dug in near the dead Marines, still lying on the road. On July 3rd, they were joined by 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, a fresh unit helicoptered in from USS Okinawa. But a navigation error put the battalion 3,000 meters short of its landing zone, meaning the link-up was not made until late that afternoon, and the joint attack could not begin until the following day. That navigation error would be costly. It handed the NVA an extra 24 hours to reinforce their positions and prepare the ground for what was coming. On July 4th, both battalions attacked north toward the marketplace. But the NVA had used their extra day well. Concealed positions in spider holes and bunkers stopped the advance cold, inflicting casualties on units that never sighted a single enemy. When Marine air support was called in, a Skyhawk put 2 bombs into their own lines. By the end of the day, Bravo's dead were still on the road. A 3rd Battalion was being lifted in, and the Marines were now taking casualties, trying to recover casualties. When darkness fell, Bravo's dead were still on the road. The NVA pulled back overnight, but left mines in the ground behind them. On July 5th, Marines moved back into the marketplace under mortar fire to recover their dead. The bodies had now been in the July sun for 3 days, so they wore gas masks to cover the stench. The dead were loaded onto tanks and carried south to the trace. But recovering those 34 men had taken 3 days, 3 battalions, and a further 15 Marines killed on July 4th alone. The ground was back in Marine hands, but the artillery north of the DMZ was not finished with Con Thien. The NVA had not withdrawn, and Operation Buffalo was not finished. Colonel Giroux's 9th Marines were still pushing to hold the ground around Con Thien and drive the NVA back across the DMZ. Command needed intelligence on what was assembling north of the trace. So on July 6th, a combined force of Alpha and Charlie companies from 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, the same depleted battalion that had lost Bravo 4 days earlier, was ordered 1,200 meters forward to establish a patrol base. Captain Slater, commanding the force, told his battalion commander his men were exhausted and too weak for another major contact. But before dark, his Marines were dug in, every field of fire assigned, and with the surrounding approaches pre-registered with artillery. That night, an NVA column moved south in the dark and walked straight into Slater's position. The Marine line opened fire at 100 meters, and the column broke. But it then returned, surrounding the patrol base, attacking from every side, close enough to throw grenades over the wire. The fighting went hand to hand, but the prepared positions held what a road column could not. American artillery landed within 75 meters. The fields of fire denied the NVA the gaps they needed, and by 2200, the attack was broken. First Light then confirmed what the night had done. 154 NVA dead around Slater's perimeter, with 12 Marine casualties. Intelligence officers later determined the 400-man column was only part of the assault. The rest of the 90th NVA Regiment had simultaneously hit the 2 Marine battalions across the wider position. But the position that had held through the night could not stay occupied. Fixed positions under NVA observation remained targets, and the NVA artillery north of the DMZ was still registered on them. At 0520 on July 7th, Slater gave the order to withdraw. His men moved south, and 30 minutes after the last Marine cleared the ground, NVA artillery struck it, accurate but too late. But the guns that missed the patrol base were the same guns that had been tracking Con Thien since the first day of Operation Buffalo. The patrol base was not their primary target. Con Thien was, and the Marines still inside its perimeter were about to find out what those guns could do to a bunker. While Slater's men were moving south, the NVA artillery turned toward Con Thien itself. A 152mm artillery round came through the doorway of the 1st Battalion's command bunker and brought the overhead down. 15 men were killed. 1st Lieutenant Howell was among them. The the officer who had gone back into the marketplace 5 days earlier and helped evacuate 24 wounded men to safety. Lieutenant Colonel Sheening, the battalion commander, survived, but the guns that had reached inside the perimeter were still firing from north of the DMZ, and Con Thien was still in their sights. In the days that followed the bunker strike, Marine units pushed the remaining NVA forces back north, finding bunker complexes and prepared positions, but no longer facing the coordinated attacks that had destroyed Bravo Company. The 90th NVA Regiment had been broken, more than 1,200 of their dead counted across the operation, their July offensive spent. By the time Operation Buffalo ended, after 12 days on July 14th, Marine losses across the operation stood at 159 killed and 345 wounded. 1st Battalion, 9th Marines had been pulled out of Con Thien, and Bravo Company had been destroyed as an effective rifle company. When the last shot was fired, the Marines held no ground beyond Con Thien's wire. The barrier was still unfinished, and the NVA artillery was already repositioning inside the DMZ. For another story of small American units facing overwhelming NVA odds, the video on screen covers a Special Forces unit that landed and held directly between 2 NVA battalions, outnumbered and outgunned from the moment their helicopters touched down.